The weird thing about coaching in education and consulting as far as screenwriting goes and story in general is that there's nothing incredibly new to teach. Really, even for most of you tuning in and whether you're just beginning as far as I've never written a screenplay before, or you're a veteran and you've been doing this for years, there's nothing really new. We all have this inherent understanding of story because we're surrounded by story on a regular basis, literally from Instagram stories to Facebook stories to books that we're constantly reading, TV shows, news stories, articles. We're surrounded by story. So I think a little bit of a piece of confidence that we can all take away, just as a way to wrap up this crazy year, is to, rely on your inner storyteller as much as you can and are able, and then educate yourself from there. You don't want to be coming from a place of being a know-it-all, because we don't know it all. I don't know it all. I'm constantly learning. All these different webinars that I help host and various consultants that we bring on, and our ISA Friday Presents events, where we're interviewing people in the industry. I'm learning something literally every day. So we have to be doing that, so there's this balance between let's educate ourselves, make sure that we're constantly honing our craft, but it's also honing a craft that we do at least understand inherently, because we are inundated by these just story in general. So I think that's a nice way to start. Have some confidence that even if you're brand new at this or you've been doing this forever, there are plenty of elements to story that you already understand. Who else can't wait for 2020 to end? I think we're all kind of feeling that. Montreal, Norwich. I think we're all feeling that. We're all looking forward to the end of this year. At the same time, how many times do we have the year 2020? Literally once. So let's make the most of these last, month and a half time frame. In whatever way you feel is important and necessary. But it's also one of the reasons we're putting this class on, to just kind of round out the year. I've hosted, I think it's been, I guess, since October of last year that we started these. It might have been September. I've done one a month since then, and this is just a part of what the ISA offers. But AJ saying, thankfully, only one 2020. Yeah, it's a little bit of a bummer, because it's, obviously we have to be optimistic as much as possible. Change is always difficult, regardless of what year it's in. And who knows, there may be more difficult years to come. So, and that's, sounds like me being negative, but, we can try to learn from this as much as we can. As crazy as the world is right now, especially American politics, regardless of the side you're on, we're all in this together. And I think that is really ultimately where we need to be coming from, that whatever one side does, it affects the other and vice versa. And so what can we do to just, I don't know, God forbid, help people out here? It's nuts enough as it is. And I think there's some hope moving into 2021. Anyway, going back to what I was saying, story in general, we're going to be talking about that as far as how to brainstorm new projects, new concepts. We want to be moving into 2021, with this understanding of making sure your concept is worth your time. And I think I've mentioned this in previous classes, maybe webinars that we put on as far as events with the ISA. You have to have this determination, both being determined, but also to determine whether or not this is, like I said, worth your time. Because how long does it take to fully develop something? I mean, from literally nothing to it's done, it's ready, I can submit to contests, I can have people read it, taking a serious bent to consideration. Final draft. 6 months, if you're really fast and if you don't have a crazy life, you have a ton of time in your hands, maybe 3, 4. Some people who are just naturally gifted can maybe write a fully developed script in a month. Again, there are so many factors that come into play. But even that month, that's a month of your life, at least just for writing the screenplay, that you have to focus on, this one particular project. So you have to, have this understanding that your time is valuable. Obviously whatever project you're working on is hopefully valuable too. So that's where I'm going to be coming from this place of just conceptual brainstorming. I have some notes written out that I'll go through, and I apologize if it looks like I'm reading, but it's because I am. You know, full transparency here. It's a big topic in terms of talking about brainstorming new ideas, you know, the best way to approach that, because when you're talking about concept, and just a little bit of a review, there are 4 levels of development, so-called. Concept, character, structure, and page work. And I'm doing this in terms of from top to down, because this is really how readers in the industry, whether they're executives or producers or readers on somebody's desk, they're unconsciously thinking, do I like the concept? Okay, cool. How's the character working? Is character good? Okay, let's consider structure. Is the structure all right? Then let's look at the words on the page. The irony is that the first thing a reader sees are the words on the page. So if the words on the page aren't working, you're ruining all other 3 levels. Even though the concept, structure, and character may be amazing, if the formatting is ridiculous and it's unreadable, they're not even going to read it. You know, so the easiest thing for you to do is just buy Final Draft, invest in Writer Duet, which I think is like $20 a month, or you know, Movie Magic Screenwriter, which I think is a little expensive, but definitely invest in some kind of professional screenwriting software. Don't rely on the Word templates. Just don't. They're never correct. We always notice. It's the easiest thing you can do as far as at least making sure the formatting's correct. Make sure that's right, because we don't want to ruin your script just because the formatting doesn't look right, or you have these giant, huge chunk paragraphs and there's so much black on the page. You know, the page work stuff is technically the easiest part, even though dialogue obviously is a challenge. Nonetheless, this is why it's hard to talk about just concept, because all 4 levels of these levels of development are connected. But when coming up with a new idea, like I was saying, you have to ask yourself, is this idea worth my time? Am I, willing to spend at least the next 6 months, potentially longer, especially if the thing actually does get picked up and go into production? It could be a 5 to 10 year process. You have to be asking yourself, do I love this thing enough? Am I excited enough because of these reasons to spend the time on it? How do you then come up with answers to that? You know, like, here's why I feel like this is worthwhile. So I wrote down some notes, some things that we can consider. And, you know, none of these are necessarily more important than the other. These are just all these broad questions that we have to be thinking about when we have an idea. And this is not necessarily in reference to rewrites, you know, an existing idea. This is like, I have a log line of something that I think might be worthwhile. So you want to be asking, and this is the irony, right, when considering concept, but who's our main character and what's that character's flaw? So again, it's difficult to, you know, bring in concept here, because you can't really talk about concept without referencing character. And then you can't really reference character without the structure, because structure is driven by character choices. And then the concept is, of course, delivered and executed by the characters making those choices within the structure. So everything's connected. But nonetheless, looking at your character, that flaw, and then this is something that hopefully, if there's anything you take out of this, you know, this is it. From a character perspective, the word flaw, A, does not have to be a negative thing. He doesn't have to be, you know, a horrible person, or, you know, an alcoholic, or, you know, something terrible. It doesn't have to be that. The flaw ultimately is, you know, we all have flaws. I have flaws, and I don't think I'm a horrible person. At least I hope I'm not. But it's holding us back, right? There's some level of an issue going on inside of us that is holding us back from being the best version of ourselves. This goes for quite literally any story, no matter how big or small the flaw is. Marlin in Finding Nemo, major flaw in that he was overprotective. He was terrified of letting his son grow up because of this major wound of what happened in their past when his wife was killed by these other fish, and then Nemo was, you know, the only egg left, and, you know, you have this little backstory. That's that wound. So his flaw then becomes that he's overprotective and scared of letting his son grow up. The worst thing that could have happened to Marlin was that his son is lost, kidnapped, and he's lost somewhere out in the middle of this giant ocean, right? That story then is set up for Marlin to change, to become different and better than he was. Not every story is going to involve that type of giant arc, right? Marlon is one way in the beginning, he's almost completely different in the end. We don't need that big of an arc, but we do need to look at the flaw inherent in your character, not by way of the outward stuff. Yes, overprotective is a flaw, but it's based on a deeper wound. If someone's an alcoholic, it's a little bit of a symptom of something else that happened. Yes, alcoholism is a flaw, but it isn't necessarily the flaw, right? So we'll maybe differentiate the words. Jen Grisanti uses the word wound. I think wound's a good word because the wound kind of creates the symptoms, right? The flaws themselves. The flaw you can consider as an active, it's active. It's something that creates scenes. It creates moments. It helps define the situation that the characters are in, right? Because you could have a situation where, let's just go look at Finding Nemo. Marlin's out in the ocean and he's trying to find his son. Because of who Marlin is, it creates a more dramatic situation. The situation itself is already pretty dramatic, but it adds to the drama because of his flaw and how he's reacting to the situation. That can literally be said for any character in any story. So that's why it's directly connected to concept, right? Because when you're delivering a concept, you want the audience, whoever the audience might be, a producer, manager, executive, me, a contest reader, looking at the log line, we'll say, they want to be able to anticipate what might happen in the second act, because now we're engaged. We, as in the reader, we're engaged in what might occur. That's going to help obviously sell your project. That's still, it's directly referencing concept, but by way of character. So wound is something deeper than flaw. The flaw is the outward reaction to the wound. Eventually the wound is what needs to be corrected, right? He has to be okay with losing his son, which is very difficult. I'm talking about Marlon. And being okay with letting him go. I mean, there's literally, and Disney, of course, is famous for this, there's literally a moment where Dory yells at Marlon, "You have to let go." And this is what you see in a lot of family-oriented animated projects. The theme is quite literally stated. Again, you don't need to do that, but I'm going to end up rambling because I love Finding Nemo so much, but there's so many elements of Finding Nemo that you can use as an example as far as perfect structure, character involvement. I'm not saying that you need to match structure perfectly like Finding Nemo. Obviously, TV shows don't match that type of structure, but there is still that approach to beat by beat. Anyway, you can see what I'm saying here. Concept is delivered by character and structure, so they're all connected. Nonetheless, you want to understand what your character's flaw is deep down, and if you don't, do the work in list making, brainstorming, write out different situations that may have nothing to do with your story to put the character in, and just see how that character might react. If you sit your character down on, a therapist's couch, ask that character questions. How's that character going to be responding to those questions? You have to do the character work so that you can understand, once I place this character within this situation, now I know the kind of drama that's going to come out. And I've used this example a few times. And I'm using it mainly only because I've only played Dungeons and Dragons, I think literally 3 times in my life, probably more like 2. So it's not like I'm a huge Dungeons and Dragons fan, but I've used the example because it's a fun one. But Dungeons and Dragons is actually a perfect example for character and story development, especially character development. For anybody who's played it, I'm not looking at the comments, by the way, you may be commenting, but Tosh plays it every week, which I'm a little jealous. It's actually a ton of fun. But what's so fun about it is that you have all these character sheets. I think they literally call them character sheets, where you're rolling the dice to see what type of characteristics that these characters have, and you're writing down all these crazy numbers and all these different things, and you're building out your character, but you're doing that so that you know how that character is literally from a dice level, from an ability level, how that character is going to react once you start playing the game. Once the game begins, the dungeon master presents, here's the situation, and you then go into how these characters react to the situation. It's the same exact thing from a story standpoint, from a screenplay, from a novel, TV series. same exact thing. Build the character out so you know how the situation that's already been created in Brainstorm is going to react. We have to be able to see that when we're developing ideas. You can't just go from a place of, here's this adventure, but you're only presenting like the setup to it. And I see that a lot in log lines where you're really just presenting the first act. We have to be getting beyond the first act in a log line or a pitch, so that the person hearing the pitch or reading the log line understands, well, here's where I'm going to be experiencing most of, or spending most of my time and experiencing most of the story in the second act. In a TV series, where the audience is spending most of their time is still in the middle of the episode. You still have the setup, whether it's a half-hour sitcom or an hour-long drama. You still have the presentation of episode situation that this particular character that we in the pilot are just now getting introduced to is going to experience, right, in the middle of the episode. The primary difference, obviously, with TV is that it's a feature-length film told over 10, 12, 15 episodes. If it's network, it's a little bit more procedural most of the time. So there's really no difference other than length of time of each episode, but they're still going along the same beat structure that a film follows. There you go, Adam. Stuff on the character's wound is so important. Yeah, you have to be able to differentiate the two, because that, again, defines how the character is going to be responding, reacting, and acting in the second act, in the overall situation of the movie. In a TV series, it's a little different because it depends on your show. If you have a 911 network, drama, those characters are pretty much just who they are, who they're always going to be. And then you're putting them into situations every episode. And then the drama unfolds because the situation's pretty wild or there's highly dramatic. But then you have the side character storylines where you're learning about what these people are doing. And there might be slight evolution over a period of, an entire season or something. Breaking Bad was basically that. He started off as a good guy, he broke bad. We see the process of him breaking bad until the end of the season, and he slightly, learns his lesson. Maybe, that's part of the fun of the end of that show. But he does basically, get there. So TV is that much more important in terms of developing this idea of hook, because you have to, hopefully, you're going to have the audience tune in every week to watch your show. As opposed to a movie, they can sit down for an hour and a half to 2 hours and go, all right, well, I'm done with that. I liked it or I didn't. You can't really afford in TV for the possibility for people to not like it. I mean, people are not going to like it. But so Judith is asking the question, how do you generate concepts for stories? So all of this is kind of referencing this. So you have to, for one, come up with a really interesting character, and I'll get into how to do that. We want to understand what the plot goal is. So there's the difference between a plot goal and a main character personal goal. And that can be a little confusing. And Judith, I promise I'll get to that question, because this whole thing is going to be kind of talking about that. But the reason it's not as easy of an answer to, or a question to answer, is because there are so many elements that come into play. And I don't want to just, give easy little exercises that might help generate some ideas, because there are so many things we have to consider. And this is why that initial opening, I presented, this idea of, is this worth your time? Is this idea worth your time? You have to be asking these questions. I get plot, goal, and character through line. Okay, well, bear with me, Judith. We'll get there. So yeah, what is the plot goal? What's the main character's personal goal? What's the difference? So we have a character wanting something, desiring something that really has nothing to do with the plot. The plot is then introduced as an opportunity for the character to pursue the personal goal. Personal goal eventually shifts and evolves as you go along. But all of this, from character flaw and how that flaw is going to be interacting with the second act, meeting plot goal and personal desire, is helping create this situation that the character is going to be in that second act. It's the recurring moment. I refer to that a lot in the craft course. And really, the recurring moment is just another term for hook. What's the hook of your movie? So, I'm trying to get to Judith's question as quickly as I can, because I'm sure everybody is wondering this. How do you brainstorm new ideas? It's usually coming from character first or just general story. So if you have, I'll use one of my own ideas as an example, probably because likelihood of it going anywhere, and I don't think anybody's going to steal it. But I came up with this idea based on this question I had in my head, and I may have even shared this in some of my previous classes. I'm kind of big, not big, but I enjoy watching those stupid ghost paranormal shows. And I was watching one of them, and there's a type of haunting called an attachment, and where a ghost is attached to you, and even if you go home, suddenly your home is also haunted. And I had this funny question of, well, what if the ghost didn't want to be attached to you? And it kind of made me laugh. And since I laughed, I thought, well, there might be a comedy there, because you have two characters that are stuck to each other. One of them is dead, one of them is alive. And so from there, so basically one answer to your question, Judith, is ask a question of any kind, a thematic question, or what if this happened? What if a doctor was forced to play NFL football and was going to be killed if he didn't win the Super Bowl? I don't know. I mean, I'm throwing this out there just randomly, but just asking questions, like what if questions. So what if these two people were stuck to each other? So from there, which was purely a character-oriented situation, I had no story. I didn't know what the second act was going to be. From there, I pulled out certain issues about those characters that will help enhance the level of conflict between the two. And you can do the same thing with really any story idea. You come with the character first, and you're thinking, okay, what can I do with this character in terms of who she is that's going to make life in general more difficult? And then start asking what if questions. What if I put this character into this situation? What if I put this character into that situation? Now you're starting to get into this reference to hook, because you have, and I want to get to my notes here because I talk about this. Let me see. Yeah, have we seen this character before? If so, what can we do to make the character just a little bit different? That's kind of what I was talking about. Elevate the character in a way that we haven't seen this type of character before. We've seen most types of characters, but what can we do to make that character a little bit different? And I have some examples I'll get to in a second. This other level of question. So have we seen the situation before? Does the character combined with the situation, like I've been talking about, help make your project like nothing else the audience has seen? And that's a really big question, because we have to be delivering as screenwriters, because there are a lot of us. And right now on this call, I think we have 66, including me, 66 screenwriters, all trying to create material and get it out around town, hopefully, create success. This 66 is not very many, but it's still 66. There are a lot of people out there trying to do what we're doing. So we have to come from a place of, how unique is my project? Have people seen this before? Because that then goes back to my idea of, is this worth my time? If it's kind of derivative, if there's really nothing all that unique and different about it, then it probably isn't all that special. And, our executive's going to be responding to this project as much. So how you make a project unique, that's a big question, because it's looking at character and the situation you're going to be putting the character in. So like if you look at a movie like The Purge, so there are plenty of elements in that movie that are familiar and derivative a little bit, especially like the family involved. There are a lot of elements to that family that we've kind of seen before, the father figure especially. But when you put those derivative elements into a situation that's pretty different, the 190-year anarchy is a pretty unique idea. But at the same time, we've seen anarchy, we've seen people go crazy in small neighborhoods, we've seen some elements, but you're building up on that. So again, it's that question of, what if there was one night a year where the government allowed all of society to do anything they wanted? That's the beginning of a brainstorm process. So what if questions are great. But point being with this is that we've seen a lot of the elements that already occur in The Purge. We hadn't really seen it when they were combined that way. It helps that we haven't really heard of that question, what if one night a year there was allowed anarchy? I mean, that not every movie is going to have that big of a unique hook. but nonetheless, you know, the difficulty with, oh, I don't want to skip anything. Yeah, yeah, and that's the fun part, because I'm looking at my notes here. The Purge allowed for those derivative characters to feel a little more unique, because we hadn't really seen that situation before, when the characters really weren't that unique. We've seen those characters before. They felt elevated because of the situation. So that's you know, something to remember. You don't have to have purely unique characters to have a unique project. You have to have some level of two things working together that helps create the uniqueness. We haven't quite seen this situation before, or we haven't quite seen this character before. Or if you've seen this type of character, we've seen this type of situation, but I've never seen them put together. That's, again, a part of the brainstorming what if process. What if I had this thing match with this thing? What if I had that match with that? And just start seeing what can work out, and whatever allows for the most conflict and drama is probably the project that's going to win out. Like, oh, I should probably focus on that one. The difficulty with uniqueness then, of course, is the execution of the uniqueness in a simple way. So like, look at the movie Cloud Atlas. I don't know if you've seen it. I watched it, I don't know, years ago. And this just popped in my head when I was writing my notes. But does anyone really know what that movie was about? It was ridiculous. And, you know, maybe from a thematic level, you started seeing some messages. But just because it was unique doesn't necessarily mean it was entertaining. So that's the difficulty. That's the execution side of things. You know, you still have to bring it down to some simple level. You know, it's easy to come up with some wild magical realism adventure that has a totally jumbled structure where things happen all over the place, and you know, it's more of an abstract film. Sure, you can call it unique, but how many people are really going to be into that? It's not to say that there isn't a place for those abstract types of, you know, pieces of art in the industry. Of course there is. But if you're looking for a long-term career to, you know, not only sell a project, but at least use a project as something that you write on spec to help get you jobs, you know, generally speaking, the mainstream public needs some level of simplicity to be able to engage in the show. It doesn't mean that what happens in the show has to be lame or, you know, unspecific or overly simple. There does at least need to be an approach that the marketability behind this is easy enough for people to understand once they get into the show. So let me see. I want to make sure I'm not skipping anything. Yeah, like in what am I saying? All these elements can present a unique project, but again, it doesn't mean the story itself was easy enough to follow. You know, I'm still referencing Cloud Atlas. On the reverse side of things, if you look at the Queen's Gambit, I don't know if anybody is watching the Queen's Gambit on Netflix right now. I finished it last week. If you haven't watched it, you should. You know, I'm not guaranteeing you're going to love it, but I personally really enjoyed it. It was not only extremely well done from just a basic production value, what they did photographically, from wardrobe to just the look of, I mean, that in and of itself from a production value is amazing. But the story, I mean, the fact that they made chess exciting is mind-blowing to me. But the reason it was exciting was because of how much we connect with our main character almost immediately. We see this poor girl who is forced to be an orphan. She goes through that orphan process. She pretty quickly shows that she's a little different. But then what ultimately makes the show unique is that we hadn't seen a young woman, you know, first young girl who grows up to be a young woman with a huge substance abuse problem, like not just a little, major substance abuse problem for all the right, you know, technical reasons because of all the trauma she'd experienced, who was not only a math genius, but a chess genius. Like she is literally one of the best, if not the best chess player in the world, basically on her own, going, you know, through this process of becoming a world champion. When you put all of those things together, all of those individual parts we've seen before, substance abuse, young orphan, by herself, She's extremely smart. You know, you have, then also, you know, just chess in general. We've seen stories of Bobby Fischer, and, you know, we've seen these things. But when you put all of them together in the 60s, she's barely, what, 18 by the end. Actually, she might be 21, 22 by the end. But, you know, this process of all of the stuff put together, now we've got something unique. So that's the difficulty of uniqueness. It's not like every single element of your story has to be unique. It's how you then put these elements together from the what if aspect of what if this character is in this situation? You know, what if a football team needed to perform a bank heist in the middle of their game? I have no idea how that would happen. But, you know, basic questions like this of just putting a couple different elements. We've seen bank heists, we've seen football players, that we've seen do at the same time. You know, you just have to get creative with your question asking. That's going to help with some brainstorming. No spoilers for Mateo in terms of the Queen's Gambit. Really worth your time. A little slow to start, I will say. Just give it at least the first episode, and then, you know, get into the second one. But I just want to get into some of these comments here. Cloud Atlas, one story leads to another, the characters are reborn. Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of merit behind the Cloud Atlas. I'm not trying to say it was a terrible movie, but they were trying to do so many things with it that after a while, it was very difficult to follow. From a level of mainstream approach, difficult, you know, obviously it's worthwhile from a visual standpoint, from the acting, and when you look at the whole piece, you can see some genius in there. So, you know, I'm not trying to talk down. But, you know, we are all writers who, I'm assuming, have yet to really make it big, to really make a splash, to create a career out of this process. Doing so with a very abstract, non-mainstream project, it's very possible. It's very doable to do it that way. But it's going to be a few extra hurdles for you to get over because, you know, the industry in general, they haven't quite come to trust you as a writer yet. So we have to allow the industry to trust us. And then eventually we can get our cloud atlases out there and we can take some chances. And, you know, or if you're going to make the movie yourself, write whatever this, you know, incredibly unique project might be, and then direct it. You know, obviously you got to get the financing, and, you know, make the movie and then prove yourself, look what I did. And then people might see it a little differently. But anyway, so let me see, let me make sure I'm hitting it all. But one little note, and I'm jumping way ahead because it's important to just make this note. Because I see in a lot of scripts, and I read a ton, everybody at the ISA, we're reading so many scripts every day. We try to use dialogue as a way to deliver the concept, for one thing. But dialogue also does not make a concept unique. And I know, like, most of you are thinking, well, of course that should go without saying. But it does speak to execution. You know, it's one thing to come up with a great idea. Executing it is a whole other thing. I've read so many log lines where I'm like, wow, this is pretty cool. I'll definitely read that. I open the script and it's like 10 pages in. I'm thinking, boy, what is this? What happened? And like the execution of the concept, that promise of the premise, you know, they just haven't nailed the execution yet. So we can't rely on the dialogue to deliver the concept. You know, the conflict inherent in your situation is what drives the concept. It's what makes that concept worthwhile. It's what makes it unique. You know, the catch that the character drives the conflict and thus the situation, but you don't have to have, like I was saying, a unique character in order to have a unique concept. If you do have a purely unique character, that, and my note says most, not all, but most projects that have truly unique characters have titles with the character's name. You know, if you look at, well, yeah, that's what I'm saying, just because it's so rare to present an entirely unique character, so it's the most unique element of your story, so the movie's probably going to be named after them, because that's what people are going to be tuning in to see, that character. You know, little Shrek, Austin Powers, this old movie with Will Smith, called Hancock, which I actually really enjoyed. The Amazon show, if you haven't seen it, called Hannah. We've seen an assassin, we've seen a female assassin, we've seen Russian agents, we've seen government conspiracy, we've seen these, shadow groups, doing something behind the scenes that's illegal and horrible. Have we really seen like a 14-year-old girl trained to be the greatest assassin ever? No, we hadn't really seen that. So it's called Hannah. And then the rest of the story is, of course, in a TV series approach, her process of not only becoming it, but the personal stories involved, all the intrigue that goes on with the other characters in the school that she has to go to. Really worthwhile if you haven't watched it, especially if you like action movies. But point, like I was saying, you don't have to have a unique character in order to have a unique situation. The combination of situation and character is usually what helps generate a unique concept. Let's see, questions or comments. Let's see here, Adam. High concept shortcut if you like based on stories. Tell the story no one knows about the person, place, or thing that everyone knows. It worked for me. So anyway, tell the story no one knows about the person, place, or thing that everyone knows. Oh, I see. So yeah, so if you have either a biopic or, like you're saying, based on a particular true event, dig in and find, like he's saying, person, place, or thing that everyone knows, but we don't know this portion of the story. That's a great idea. The Crown takes a familiar story, finds a unique take for each episode. The characters may be familiar, but the inner turmoil is not. Yeah. So, and that's what's hard about saying, here's how you brainstorm a concept. Because story is so relative, not only to the story itself, but to you, the writer, because your perspective on it, your voice is what's going to make it different compared to somebody else who has the same exact idea and how they're going to execute it. I've been using this example with some of my writers as a way to consider, what your voice might be. But if you see a situation, a basic situation of two people, a man and a woman sitting in a diner, diner's kind of busy, the man's on one side of the booth, the woman's on the other side, and they're obviously having conversation, but he is kind of leaning over, his leg is bouncing up and down, and he's really engaging in what he's saying. She isn't really engaging. She's leaned back, arms folded, and she's not looking at him. Just looking at that situation, almost all 65 of us will probably have some different interpretation of that, what it means, what's happening, what's the dynamic, what's the genre of the situation. Some people might see how incredibly dark and horrible and sad it is. Some people might think it's really funny. Maybe there's romance involved. Maybe it's conspiracy and political intrigue. We're all going to see it differently. Like if you gave Judd Apatow a Nightmare on Elm Street, it's going to be a much different Nightmare on Elm Street than a horror director is going to be presenting. So that also is this level of how do I brainstorm a concept? It's your take on the concept that's also going to be helping it in terms of its uniqueness. Let's see here. Julia has a couple questions in Q&A. Cool. Okay, let's see. Christy, the process sounds like a mix and match from Clue. Colonel Mustard in the library with a candlestick. I love that metaphor. Totally. It's one of the reasons why board games like that are so replayable, because there are all these different situations, different character, different item, different room, and every situation is going to be a little bit different. And you can imagine what might have happened with a different item, with a different character in a different room. I love that metaphor. Let's see here. Yeah. Anyway, beautiful. I hope that was helpful, but let me get into the Q&A here. If you guys have more questions, obviously feel free to ask. Okay, for the character development, do you write down the answers? Absolutely. There could be multiple answers. There could be multiple things that are in response to the question you're asking about the character, the question. And honestly, you can probably Google, I don't have it with me, but you can Google, character development questions, and I guarantee you there's going to be a list of 100 different things you can ask your character. Well, yeah, ask your character. But I tend to have my writers go through a process of listing 50 different ways to present the character visually, without, out of context. What kind of clothes do they wear? What's the bedside clock next to their bed? What kind of artwork do they hang in their apartment? Maybe they have a mansion. Do they have a condo? Why would they have a condo? Can they not afford, a particular condo, or can they afford a house? All these questions lead to new questions. Why can't they afford? Why are they renting and they're 57? Does that mean they've had issues? Or maybe they're saving. Maybe they're saving up for what? What do they? So there are all these questions that are leading to the development of who this person might be. And sometimes it might lead you down, a corridor where you're like, I don't really like that character. So you start over and you just ask some new questions. But you can Google character development questions. You're going to find a ton. But yeah, feel free to write down the questions. But after a while, you may build a character that you're just not all that excited about. What you could do from a situational standpoint is kind of like what one of the comments was saying about it, a based on idea, but the what if questions, knowing your genre is really important. Knowing that you want to write a horror movie, what can you do from a horror standpoint, and do something new and different, because just because it's a horror movie doesn't mean you need a haunted house or you need a ghost or you need a monster. Look at Get Out. The monsters in there were real people, and the situation became horrific because of the built-in character meeting the situation. That story was probably, I don't know, coming from a thematic standpoint. I want to talk about, racism, unconscious bias in a different way. Maybe I'll make it a horror movie, but I don't want to do, Freddy or Texas Chainsaw. There's a brainstorm level from genre, and asking about what kind of situation could I make horrific that isn't generally horrific, because, a boyfriend, girlfriend going to meet the girlfriend's parents for the first time, in general, that's not horrific, but what can you do to make it horrific? And from there, you start asking those questions. You start answering it from just a basic plot level. Then you go to character and go, okay, well, what kind of character can I throw in there that's going to make it more dramatic, more difficult? What can I do about the backstory? So it's coming from both sides. Let's see, Emily is asking, what other ways are there to let the audience know about the character's wound or backstory besides flashbacks? So it's a really good question, because flashbacks are fine, but they're overused, I think, from a script standpoint. I'm not going to tell you not to use flashbacks. They tend to annoy me because it feels like a crutch sometimes. But that's just me, and we've seen plenty of movies and TV shows where there are excellent flashbacks. The whole point of a flashback, though, is to give us, insight into new things that we're going to later learn, as opposed to just exposition. But anyway, ways to present wound and flaw. Current and present interactions with other people and situations. It totally depends on what the wound is, but when you first start with your story, meaning like first act, we're not necessarily going to know what the wound is. We're going to get an understanding. Like with Queen's Gambit, we don't really know exactly what happened to the young girl when we first meet her. We know that something pretty bad happened. We don't know why. We just know, well, she's an orphan. And because you haven't watched it yet, I don't want to give away some details. And inherent in orphan is a lot of different wounds. You've been left behind, you feel lonely, you feel like an outcast. There are a lot of things that come just inherently with that situation. So Queen's Gambit does rely a lot on technical flashbacks, but they don't necessarily use them as a memory that the character's having. We spend a decent chunk of time in the past, so then we go through a story approach from the past. So there's one way of, allowing the flashbacks to be a story itself, as opposed to just a flash, back into time. But you want to be considering what, up front, if the character has, this blind ambition where they're completely selfish. And sometimes you don't, like, if you look at, like Gordon Gekko from Wall Street, do we really care what his deeper wound is? He's just a greedy asshole, and he really isn't going to necessarily learn a lesson by the end, because he's technically the opponent. But Charlie Sheen's character, being the main character, is going to be the one who evolves through the problems that character experiences. And so there are certain flaws that don't necessarily need this extremely deep wound. Charlie Sheen's character is more along the lines of, I want so badly to be successful because my family expects it of me, or they don't expect it of me, and I want to prove them wrong. So there's this level of you know, it's like a surface level wound, but it's then drawing out the other flaws of materialism, egoism, all these other isms. And so again, it depends on the wound, but showing the character in a present moment and how that character reacts to a person either touching, pressing that person's buttons, how does the character react in the present time? Like, and I've used this example in the past from 3 Billboards Outside of Ebbing, Missouri with Frances McDormand. Early on, we see her screaming at the guy that runs the sign, billboard company. This poor kid, he's like 28. Frances McDormand's character is just being horrible to this kid, just calling him horrible things, screaming at him. And this kid's like, oh my God, what do I do? And she's so angry. And she's acting like a monster. We then have her pause and she doesn't say anything, do anything, but she looks over at the windowsill and she sees on the windowsill a beetle that has been flipped over and its legs are kind of, trying to turn itself over again. She goes over and she lightly picks up the beetle, flips it over, and lets it continue on its way. What you see in that moment, which is in present time, it's not a flashback, is so much about who this character is. We see that she has extreme anger problems, that she can act like a monster, but she is actually not a monster. If we wanted to present her as a monster, she would have just smushed that bug. She would have killed her without even thinking about it. So we see layers to the character, that there is emotion, that she cares so much. So the anger is coming from needing redemption as opposed to revenge or something more evil, right? So does that necessarily show the wound? No, but it shows a layer behind the flaw, right? Her flaw of extreme anger, frustration, an over the top need for redemption to the point of taking action to, change things. But we understand a lot about her within just that moment. So in a way, we don't necessarily want to be taking this idea of wound to a literal specific level. We don't always have to go back to the moment when someone went through trauma that then creates our present day flaw. You don't have to do that. Some flaws are inherent. Liar, Liar with Jim Carrey. He's a lawyer. He's success driven. So he lies. There isn't that much we need to go there. Part of his wound is fear, really, that he's a bad father. And so this process of going through this inability to tell a lie by way of his son is teaching him how to be a better dad. And that's what he was a little concerned with unconsciously. So it's very relative. And this is why it's difficult to be teaching things like, here's how you do it, because everything is so different. You have to be making the decision for yourself. I would ask everybody to not rely on a flashback first. If you have to use the flashback because you think it's absolutely necessary, then do it. There's nothing wrong with a flashback. We just don't want to use it as our first go-to when we're developing moments and scenes that are going to be presenting who this character is. Are there ways to keep it in the present? Are there ways to not even rely on dialogue? Can we just see the character do something that then presents who the person is? Julia, I'm working on making my book to a screenplay. Any advice or suggestions? It's a twist of thriller, romance, and mystery. So, for sure. I'm working on making my book to a screenplay. So, there's a lot of this, I can have a whole class on this. It's a big question. The tips, I guess, would come from a place of storylines, meaning how many characters do you have? Who's the main character? How do you focus the structure in a screenplay to still deliver a character-driven story? Like with a book, you can bounce all over the place, and the structure isn't necessarily the same as a screenplay structure. The general story structure is the same. You're going to be having setups, character introductions. They're going to be going on some kind of a journey. There's going to be twists, and then there's going to be a low point, and there's going to be some climax. Those are general. But you have to be looking at each individual chapter of the book and considering, okay, how many scenes do I have in each chapter, each individual chapter? Who are those scenes pertaining to? and then start backing up and defining, all right, I have my main character, I have some kind of a secondary character that's going to be going along this adventure with the main character, and then I have an opponent. Obviously, with a mystery thriller, the opponent it may not be obvious. There will be multiple opponents coming through, obviously, because there has to be a goal early on in every single movie. I don't care what movie it is, there has to be a goal that's at least defined. Here's what we're going to attempt to do, because that then sends us into the second act. The difficulty with adapting a book into a screenplay is the basic length. You know, you may not be able to use every single scene that you have in the book that you do in a screenplay. I mean, I technically took a script and then developed that into a book. So it was the opposite of what you had. And what I did was just take those scenes that I had written in the screenplay, divided them up in an organized way, and then just copied and pasted them into Word, and then said, here is a chapter. You know, I've got 4 scenes and this is the chapter. And then I would write in literary novel form to just fill out the chapter. But I found that I needed to add characters, I needed to add depth. I had some freedom in terms of going back in time, you know, to show other, you know, intrigue and what happened in past history. It was a big fantasy, you know, novel. I had more space and freedom in writing the novel, because you can take your time describing things. In a screenplay, you have very little time. You have a very set amount of pages, at least in terms of a feature length, and obviously in TV. But it's a big question, Julia. I don't know if I helped you. But the biggest thing would be define who your characters are. Who's my main character, secondary character? Who's the opponent? What does the opponent want? How do I present it in a structural sense? Do I have to go the same exact route as the book? How many of these scenes are absolutely necessary? Can I still, you know, tell the same story? We have to. The biggest reminder, the difference between a novel and a screenplay, is that a screenplay is a visual medium. It's going to eventually end up on screen, and you have to be presenting that to someone who's going to take that, like a director or a cinematographer, and make it visual. So we have to be coming at it from a visual standpoint and not just rely on dialogue to be telling that story. I see a little, P. James Norris is asking something in the comments. Let me get through some of the Q&A here first. Ava, while writing a script, should the ending already be tied down from the very beginning, or should it be written later when you've understood the story better? How do you approach the ending of the story? It's a really good question. My general easy answer would be no, I don't think you need to know the ending. I think you need to know the general place you're going to end up. The details of how it happens doesn't necessarily need to be there. So what I mean by that is that if you have a particular character with a type of personal problem who then encounters a more plot-oriented situational problem, what does that situation do to the main character to make that person different in the end? That at least needs to be understood. They have this type of flaw. How different do I want them to be in the end? You have like an opening snapshot and an end snapshot. Then you come from a place of, okay, well, if they're this type of flaw, and then this is how I want them, or at least expect them to be, because, you know, in an exaggerated sense, if they have this type of flaw, what's the opposite of the flaw? That's how that person may end up in the end. What are they going to have to do in the end to overcome that level of flaw? You know, it's the battle scene, whether it's a literal battle scene or not, like, you know, someone with a sword fighting a dragon. There's conflict that this person has to experience in order to change. That person that the main character has to face up to, the opponent in some way, embodies the fears and problems and issues and the inner conflict that the main character has. That's a really general statement. Not every single movie is exactly that way. But in general, that's what happens. Even in When Harry Met Sally, if you really break down that movie, Harry is the primary main character in that because he has the most to learn. He changes the most by the end. Sally kind of goes back and forth between his secondary, you know, like a helper type of character, and his opponent. That's usually what romantic comedies, you know, do. But Harry had to face up to Sally and admit something that he was never able to admit, and ultimately it was his vulnerability. He had to be vulnerable by the end, because if we see him in the beginning, He's totally opinionated. He's a chauvinist. He thinks he can just kind of talk his way in and out of everything. He thinks extremely highly of himself, and there's no vulnerability. He's probably terrified of being vulnerable in the beginning. Then as the process of his life unfolds, and we see him interacting with Sally, who is pretty much his opposite, he changes. He ends up getting a divorce, not necessarily because of Sally, but that changes him, and he starts opening up. And then by the end, he approaches Sally and says that he's in love with her. I mean, I know the whole ending word by word, but he admits that he wants to spend the rest of his life with her, something that he was terrified to do. So do you need to know the exact moment at the end of your story? No. Do you need to understand who the character is going to be by the end? Yeah, I think you have to have this understanding from a character development standpoint. Who is that character going to be? Then you figure out how is that character going to prove that that character is that way now. Should you trust or stick with the initial ending you thought of no matter what? No. I mean, it could totally change. I mean, when I'm working with my, unless you absolutely love the ending and you think the ending is the great, like with The Sixth Sense, that ending is kind of important. You're going to stick with that ending. The how the ending is revealed might change a little bit, but the reveal is going to be the same. It kind of depends. But when I'm working with my writers, we try to outline the entire thing so that we see from start to finish, here's generally what we think is going to happen. Get into the details. We eventually get into the pages. As we go through the pages, I tell the writer that, don't be too married to the ending, because we may come up with some new discoveries that could change at least how the ending happens. Taj, what's a tip for when you're lost in the concept? Basically, when you love your concept so much, but you keep running into character and or plot roadblocks. Lost in the concept. So when you love your concept so much, but you keep running into character or plot roadblocks. That's a tough one, Taj, because I don't necessarily know exactly what your story is. So I want to try to answer that the best I can. Reconsidering your character entirely could help move the concept along and get you out of just idea realm. Using structure as a way to brainstorm, so you start getting some of the when this happens, then this happens, until this happens approach down, just generally speaking, just to see where you're going. I think character plays a huge part in that. Like if you've been kind of stuck with a male character with a particular type of flaw, start asking yourself, well, what if he was 16 instead of 41? Or what if it was a she and she was actually 59? Start just asking questions like, would the concept still work? Don't be so stuck also on the theme behind the concept. We don't want to be coming from a place of I have to get this message across because it's so meaningful to me, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, that's important. But if you're only focused on that, then suddenly you're going to start moving into this realm of preachiness, and you're trying to teach people lessons. You have to remember that the audience's experience is going to be through the perspective of the main character experiencing all of it, because that's how they're going to then be learning whatever theme or message. We don't want to be preaching to everybody. That might have been a little bit of a tangent, but I think the answer is really through character, as opposed to, plot and concept are pretty much the same thing. Plot is a little bit more specific to goal, right? There's a literal pursuit going on in order to achieve something. And maybe that, could be a little bit of a change too. Like, well, how different would it be if we changed this goal a little bit? But the goal is still pursued by your character, and the character's experiences pursuing that goal is really what's going to make up your concept. So I think it's diving into who your character is, and making the decisions from that point. Yeah, I hope that helped, Taj, but it's a good question. Let's see. James is saying, could you repeat the levels of reading, i.e. something about character, something about concept, something, okay. So the 4 levels of development, 4 levels of evaluation, whatever you want to call this, but there are 4 primary elements when you're developing a project. But also and I have a whole class on this, James, by the way, that I think it's up on the pro tips page, and I think it's called 4 levels of valuation. But it's concept, character development, structure, page work. So concept is what we've been talking about all day. And then, you know, character development, the point of the different levels is that everything relies on the other level to be strong enough, to be worthwhile. Like if a reader is considering the project, they look at the basic concept, which is just a hook. What's the hook of the story? And they think, okay, I'm interested in that. Then they'll read it, you know, they'll start reading through the script. If they're not really attached to who the character is, then, okay, well then the other levels don't really matter. I still like the concept, but the characters aren't there. If they're into the character, they think the characters are great, then they're going to start thinking, well, how long is it taking me, the reader, to get into the second act? You know, are these scenes extremely long, 8, 9, 10 pages long, or more? You know, it's looking at the beat structure of it, and am I being led through the read quickly and easily? If the structure isn't really making sense, you know, then the page work doesn't matter. Page work then are the actual words on the page, the formatting, scene heading, dialogue, you know, all the action description that you have, parentheticals, transitions, it's all the words and letters. So if that's a mess, if the formatting's off, all the other levels, they don't matter. The producer may see something incredibly special in there, which is, you know, somewhat rare, but it happens. And then maybe they'll talk to the writer and go, look, these other things are working pretty well, but you don't know how to write a screenplay. It's a big deal because you have to come from this level of understanding that people in the industry read so much. And the irony is they hate it because of how many scripts they read that just don't work. And so it's difficult after a while. So they want to read something that's easy, that it's expected, that, you know, because there are literally tens of thousands of screenplays going around all at one time that somebody's considering, agents are sending to buyers, and, you know, then all the executives within the studios and buyers are sending all these things around, and they're considering all this material. Executives are taking pitches constantly, 4 or 5 times a day sometimes. So there is an overwhelming amount of content to consider. So if your page work isn't happening, format looks wrong, if you're not using Final Draft or some kind of screenwriting software, they're going to know, and it's going to be really difficult to get through that. So that's why all these different levels, you know, obviously today we're focusing a little more on concept. What can we do to make sure this concept's worthwhile? Is it unique? Is it different? Have we seen this character before? What can I do to make him a little, you know, more unique? You know, that level of development is important. Julia, one more. I figured I know there's more detail in books than screenplays, but I do have some flashbacks within the book to explain some of the backstory of the main character. There's some plots, twists throughout the book, and I feel like there's a lot of characters, about 8, but I know I need to add more depth to the supporting characters maybe. Okay, so one issue is that if, you know, it depends, of course you can have 8 characters in a screenplay. Most often you're gonna have more than 8, you know, actors playing a role. But how much of a role are those 8 characters playing? If they are all main characters, then we have an ensemble, which are, you know, an ensemble is extremely difficult to present because each character within the ensemble is arguably the main character. So they each have to have their own storyline that has a structure, that has a flaw that's corrected, that has a goal that they're pursuing. Suddenly you're writing 8 different stories. I'm just assuming, Julia, maybe you don't have 8 main characters. The easiest approach is looking at who's my main character? Who is the audience going to connect with the most? Like if you look at Knives Out, the main character ultimately was the maid, right? The maid who was in the middle of this wild family, you know, mystery. And mainly because the audience can relate to her more than they can relate to anybody else. Some people may argue that the detective or investigator is our main character, but, you know, he doesn't really change or evolve that much. It's much more about this maid going through this really weird, wild journey. That's a little bit more of an ensemble. than a main character oriented approach. But the maid is still primarily that main character because she's the one who is, well, I almost gave the whole story away. I won't do it. You should watch Knives Out. You'll know what I'm saying. The best approach is simplifying this as much as possible. Asking yourself, do I need all these characters? What's the primary focus that I'm wanting the audience to experience, to learn? The primary entertaining element of the story. What would happen if I did get rid of some of these characters? How much does the story really change? Because that main character doesn't have to be in every single scene, but they're probably going to be in 80% of it. We're going to be following this character's journey from who this person is in the beginning down to who they are at the end. And then, of course, the other characters that are coming along. The typical main character oriented approach to a feature is that you have a main character with an inner problem and issue. They're presented with a situation that offers up a goal, whether they reluctantly accept it or they actively accept the pursuit. They go after this goal. Someone, another secondary character, is supporting that character on that person's pursuit to achieve that goal. Meanwhile, there's an opponent that it has a separate motivation that is going to get in the way of the main character's goal, either actively and on purpose, or just it so happens this character's doing this and it's messing up this approach. That's the general approach to character, a 3-character story approach. That doesn't necessarily mean you can only have 3 characters. You can have multiple secondaries, but it's all to support and give a foundation to that main character's pursuit toward a goal. Backstory, plot, twists that involve backstory, there's nothing wrong with it, but it can't just be information for the audience. It has to also be through a character perspective. Then it just becomes as if the audience is experiencing it, but not connected to it. They're being told things as opposed to participating in this main character's journey. If we see a character learn a piece of information through a flashback, then the character is also responding to it, as opposed to the audience knowing, almost like an all-knowing force, us, the audience, and then there's no real surprise going forward. But anyway, it's I don't know the story or the project specifically, so it's hard to give exact notes there. But I hope all this is helpful, everybody. I went a little bit longer than I expected, but you all deserve it. So yeah, there's a lot more we can go into, and it's important for everybody to be educating yourselves, working on the craft, watching movies, reading screenplays. If there's anything that you should be doing, it's reading screenplays. Writers don't read as often as even actors do. We need to be reading. We have to be paying attention when we're watching a show. Watch the clock. How many minutes am I in? How many scenes have they presented before the first commercial break, or the act break, however you want to call it. Obviously, Netflix doesn't have commercials. You have to be breaking down shows from a structural standpoint, from a character standpoint. What do I know about this character 5 minutes in, 10 minutes in? If you haven't seen the movie Yesterday, where the guy hits his head and suddenly the world changes and he's the only one that knows the Beatles songs. It's an exaggerated but good example of structure. Everything happens almost exactly from this level of, sequence 1 into sequence 2 into sequence 3. It's the end of the act. We're going into the second act. Watch the movies that are overly formulaic, like The Liar Liars, The 40-Year-Old Virgin, National Treasure. Not because they're amazing movies, but you can see it so obviously, then you can start applying some of those more obvious things to your own project. And change it up however you need. Pay attention to what's going on with the ISA. We are going to be having some more events. These classes will start back up in February, not in January. I do have some room in terms of working one-on-one for consults. If you want a one-time read, you can go to the script notes section of the ISA page and purchase a craft and career evaluation. And that would be getting me on the phone and we can talk about your stuff. But like High School Musical, we're all in this together. All right, everybody, have a great rest of your week. Enjoy the holidays, and I will see you all next year.